What happens when a sitting Congresswoman walks into a courtroom alone, with no lawyer, no backing, and no intention of backing down, and dares to put the entire U.S. justice system on trial? This isn't fiction. This is the story of Jasmine Crockett, her voice, her evidence, and the showdown with Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan that no one saw coming. What began as a disciplinary hearing quickly unraveled into something much deeper. A reckoning with power, truth, and the silence that protects corruption. And what happened inside that courtroom may change everything. Before diving into the story, tell us where you are watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the moments. She didn't walk in with fanfare. No swarm of attorneys, no security detail, no carefully staged optics, just a navy blue suit, a leather case clutched in one hand, and a mind sharpened by years of watching power operate unchecked. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett entered the courtroom like someone who wasn't afraid to lose, because she already knew what silence cost. Days earlier, it had all begun in an unlikely place, a modest church gymnasium in Toledo, Ohio. Crockett had been taking questions at a local town hall, fielding topics ranging from infrastructure to immigration to veterans' benefits. It was fast-paced, familiar. Until a woman, middle-aged, weary but sharp, stood up in the back and asked a question that pierced through the noise. Why do judges keep making decisions that hurt us, even when we vote for change? The room fell silent. Crockett didn't miss a beat. Because too many judges don't fear the people anymore, she said, calmly but firmly. Some of them think they're untouchable. Some of them are. That's the truth nobody wants to say. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't wave her arms, but her words landed like a gavel. Measured, undeniable, and they didn't stop there. She spoke about lifetime judicial appointments, about political influence hidden behind black robes, about courtrooms where justice was bent by money and legacy. She cited specific rulings, cases from Texas, Oklahoma, Indiana, exposing patterns of power protecting itself. It wasn't a rant, it was a reckoning. Within hours, the clip spread like wildfire across social media. By morning, it had reached every major news outlet. Conservative commentators accused her of inciting disrespect toward the judiciary. Pundits labeled her dangerous and reckless. Threatening voicemails flooded her office. A wave of outrage swept in, not just from opponents, but from institutions that had long been insulated from critique. Her staff urged her to walk it back, release a soft statement, apologize for tone, if not content. Instead, she uploaded the full clip herself, doubling down with even more commentary, pointing out inconsistencies, naming names, and backing her claims with real case law. It wasn't noise, it was truth, unfiltered, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. In less than 72 hours, the headlines took a darker turn. Supreme Court may weigh in on Crockett comments. Chief Justice considers contempt hearing. Kagan to preside over disciplinary review of sitting Congresswoman. The nation had rarely seen a Supreme Court justice engage directly with a member of Congress, let alone in a disciplinary hearing. And yet, Crockett found herself summoned to St. Louis, Missouri, for what would be one of the most unconventional and politically charged hearings in modern judicial history. At the center of it, her words, her evidence, and the unshakable question echoing from that gymnasium floor: what happens when the people lose faith in justice? She intended to find out, and not from behind a podium, but standing alone before the bench. When the official summons arrived, bearing the seal of the U.S. Judicial Oversight Commission and the signature of Justice Elena Kagan herself, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Most thought she'd send a statement through legal counsel, perhaps contest the jurisdiction, maybe even delay the hearing. After all, Supreme Court justices don't preside over disciplinary matters like this. The very idea was unprecedented. It smelled political. It looked personal. And it was very, very real. Her advisors were frantic. Don't go, they said. It's a trap. But Crockett didn't deal in evasion. She didn't show up with an army of lawyers or a choreographed defense team. She showed up with one worn leather briefcase and the quiet confidence of someone who'd already made peace with the consequences. The night before the hearing, she stayed at a modest hotel off Lindell Boulevard in downtown St. Louis. As rain tapped against the windows, she spent hours reviewing transcripts, legislation, her own speeches, and handwritten notes in the margins of constitutional law books. She wasn't preparing to defend herself. She was preparing to indict the very system that had summoned her. Across town, Justice Kagan was restless too. Though known for her measured demeanor and judicial restraint, something about this case unsettled her. Not Crockett's accusations, those were serious but familiar. It was the raw precision of the Congresswoman's commentary, the striking accuracy that made silence impossible. Kagan had been handed a role she never asked for, both judge and symbol of a system under scrutiny. The morning of the hearing, St. Louis was bitterly cold. Wind sliced through overcoats as protesters gathered on both sides of the federal courthouse. Some waved flags, others held handmade signs scrawled with phrases like "Truth is not contempt" and "No gag on Crockett." Reporters clustered beneath umbrellas, lenses fogged, mics pointed toward the courthouse steps, bracing for what promised to be less a legal proceeding and more a political earthquake. Inside the Thomas F. Eagleton Federal Courthouse, tension hung in the air like fog. The courtroom had been cleared of its usual docket. No cameras, no phones, only notebooks, pens, and dozens of sharp, expectant eyes. Law clerks, students, former judges, congressional aides, they had all come, not just to observe, but to bear witness. At 9 a.m. sharp, the doors opened. Jasmine Crockett entered, not in heels or a power suit, but in flat shoes, a plain navy outfit, and that same leather case. Her posture was straight, her expression unreadable. She didn't acknowledge the whispers or the stares. She didn't come to perform. She came to be heard. When Justice Elena Kagan entered moments later, the courtroom stood. She wore her black judicial robe, the same one worn on the nation's highest bench. But here in this smaller chamber, with eyes locked on her every breath, it felt different. This was not a ceremonial appearance. This was confrontation. The hearing was gavelled into session. In the matter of public contempt proceedings regarding Representative Jasmine Crockett, Kagan's voice was calm but clipped, judicial but pointed. You stand here today accused of conduct unbecoming of an elected official. Statements which in this court's view may have incited a breach in public trust and undermined the legitimacy of the judiciary without due cause. The room shifted. Some leaned forward. Others stiffened. Crockett didn't blink. Kagan continued, careful and formal. This is not a criminal proceeding, but the implications are serious. Contempt, even indirect, can corrode the institutions we rely on. You may speak freely in your defense. Speak freely. That phrase surprised many. A Supreme Court justice had just opened the door wide. Crockett stood. She placed her palms flat on the table, met Kagan's eyes, and began. Justice Kagan, I won't insult your intelligence or mine by pretending I didn't know my words would land hard. I chose them carefully. I said them because I believed someone needed to, and I still do. A quiet ripple spread through the gallery. I'm not here to play defense, she continued, voice steady. I'm here to make something plain. If telling the truth is now a punishable offense, then this hearing isn't about justice, it's about control. Kagan's expression didn't change, but her eyes did. Just slightly, a flicker, a tightening around the corners, a recognition that this wasn't going to be routine. You may proceed, she said. And with that, the battle began. Not with shouting or theatrics, but with facts, dates, documents, and the unshakable courage of a woman who refused to back down in the face of power. This was no longer a disciplinary hearing. It was a constitutional confrontation, and neither woman intended to blink first. The room had barely recovered from the boldness of Jasmine Crockett's opening statement when she reached into her briefcase and pulled out the first stack of documents. This isn't a speech, she said. This isn't about ego or optics. This is about facts. What followed wasn't fiery or emotional. It was methodical, surgical. She laid out pages of notes, each one color-coded and underlined. Clipped news articles, highlighted judicial rulings, footnoted ethics violations. She moved like a prosecutor, spoke like a scholar, and built her defense not on indignation, but on undeniable, verifiable patterns of judicial misconduct. She began reading aloud. In March of 2017, she said, Judge Lynn Bosworth in Kansas City presided over a zoning dispute involving a real estate developer who had donated to her previous campaign. She never recused herself. When questioned, she said she forgot. The complaint was dismissed. Quietly, she flipped the page. October 2021, Judge Arthur Mean in Las Vegas was photographed at a private fundraiser for a law firm. That same law firm was involved in a class action case he was overseeing. Not only did he stay on the case, he ruled in their favor. Every example hit harder than the last, not because of its outrage, but because of its documentation. These weren't fringe conspiracy theories. They were real cases buried in court records and forgotten dockets. Justice Kagan read along, her face composed but increasingly still. Her fingers tightened around the pages. The audience, once skeptical, now sat rigid with focus. Every eye followed the Congresswoman who, piece by piece, was cracking the facade of untouchable authority. "These aren't anomalies," Crockett said, her voice still calm. "They're a pattern. A pattern hidden by sealed decisions and internal reviews. Judges who cross ethical lines aren't held accountable, they're protected, and when someone like me speaks up about it, I'm labeled a threat." Kagan leaned back slowly in her chair, lips pressed in a tight line. "The court is not blind to misconduct," she replied cautiously, "but there are established channels." Crockett cut in, not with disrespect, but with conviction. "Channels?" she asked, now letting her tone sharpen slightly. "Let me tell you where those channels lead. Nowhere." She slapped another document onto the table, then handed it to the clerk. It was a signed affidavit from a former staffer at the Office of Judicial Integrity, a whistleblower. This letter confirms that 2 separate judicial complaints were deliberately delayed because the judges involved were nearing retirement. The instruction? Don't stain their legacy. The gallery gasped. For a moment, even the seasoned clerk hesitated before passing the letter to the bench. Kagan took it, eyes scanning quickly, her brow furrowed. This was no longer a rhetorical argument. It was evidence. And it had weight. "This isn't about destroying the courts," Crockett continued. "It's about restoring them. I'm not your enemy, but I won't protect a system that's failing the people it claims to serve." A woman in the gallery quietly wiped a tear. A man beside her, likely a law student, scribbled feverishly into a notebook. The room was no longer just watching a hearing. It was absorbing a reckoning. Kagan, for her part, remained composed, but for the first time, she looked uncertain. She glanced down at the letter again, pausing at one name, Judge Ivan Brewster. Her eyes lingered, then flicked back to Crockett. "This is substantial," Kagan admitted, her voice quiet. Crockett didn't sit. "It's not even half of it," she replied. Then she took a single step forward and asked the question that pulled every molecule of tension into focus. "What are you willing to do about it?" The room froze. No one moved. No one breathed. Kagan didn't answer, not immediately. She sat still, eyes on the evidence before her, caught in the weight of the challenge. This wasn't about a soundbite anymore. This was about the core question institutions fear most: accountability. And just when it seemed the moment had reached its peak, Crockett reached back into her briefcase. "There's more," she said. "And it's sealed. But it shouldn't be." The room braced for what was next. You could feel the air shift. When Jasmine Crockett reached back into her case and pulled out a slim, tightly sealed manila envelope, every pair of eyes in the room followed her hand. No theatrics, no build-up, just a quiet certainty that whatever was inside would tilt the scales. She held it in both hands, not offering it just yet. "This," she said, "is a transcript from a sealed arbitration hearing, dated February 12, 2020. It involves a sitting federal judge who, during private proceedings, advised a legal team on how to phrase their settlement offer so that it would appear neutral in open court." A ripple of shock passed through the courtroom. Crockett's voice didn't waver. That same judge later ruled in favor of that team. On record. And the transcript was sealed retroactively, only after media inquiries began circling the case. Now even the clerk hesitated. The gallery leaned forward. Pens hovered midair. A low murmur buzzed across the benches like static. Justice Kagan's demeanor, unshaken until now, faltered. She straightened, adjusting the black sleeves of her robe as she narrowed her gaze. "How did you obtain this document?" Crockett stood still, composed but firm. "I won't reveal the source," she replied, "but I can confirm it should never have been sealed under federal arbitration guidelines. The seal was applied in violation of protocol, an attempt to shield a judge's unethical conduct from public scrutiny." The gravity of that sentence was nuclear. Crockett stepped closer to the bench, not in aggression, but in confrontation. "If this hearing is about punishing me for speaking the truth, then go ahead. Say it. On the record. But don't pretend this is about contempt of court. It's about protecting the silence that enables misconduct. Kagan didn't reach for the envelope immediately. She stared at it for a long second, her fingers hovering just above the flap, as though touching it would commit her to something she wasn't ready to face. Finally, she took it. Slowly, deliberately. Her eyes scanned the first few lines. She froze, then read more. The courtroom was still. So still, you could hear the sound of paper turning and someone in the gallery stifling a cough. The judge's voice, captured in the transcript, was clear, unmistakable. He hadn't just blurred the lines between impartiality and strategy. He'd stepped over them, knowingly. Kagan looked up. Her voice, when it came, was low but trembling at the edges. If authenticated, this could implicate multiple violations of judicial ethics. It's already been authenticated, Crockett said, by 2 former legal clerks and a court reporter who was fired shortly after the hearing. Now the murmurs became open whispers. Reporters scribbled like mad. A former judge seated in the second row leaned forward with a furrowed brow. Someone near the back reached for a phone before a bailiff reminded them, no electronics allowed. Justice Kagan glanced down again at the transcript, her expression unreadable, but her stillness spoke volumes. "This court is now in recess," she said suddenly. 15 minutes. The bailiff barked the official announcement. The sound broke the spell. People began to stir, stunned and unsure of what they had just witnessed. As the room cleared, Crockett sat calmly at her table. She sipped from a water bottle, her hands steady, her eyes forward. Across the courtroom, Justice Kagan stood and exited through a side door, her black robe trailing behind her like a shadow. But the battle wasn't over, it had just turned inward. In the judge's temporary chambers, the transcript lay open on a long oak desk, surrounded by a mountain of evidence, whistleblower letters, internal ethics filings, and the stark voice of Jasmine Crockett, echoing in Kagan's memory. Her legal advisor entered, whispering urgently, "Justice, we need to." Kagan raised a hand. "Not now." Alone again, she sat down, removed her reading glasses, and stared at the document. It wasn't just damning, it was undeniable. The judge's words were exact, precise, chillingly casual. He had offered tactical advice during arbitration as though he were still in chambers, a judge playing coach to a private team. The implications were seismic, not just for one case, but for the institution itself. For the first time in years, Kagan didn't feel like the final word on justice. She felt like someone watching the ground shift beneath her robe. When the recess ended, the courtroom didn't return to business as usual. It returned as a space holding its breath. Crockett stood when Kagan re-entered, not out of deference, but out of respect for the gravity of what had just occurred. The audience stood too, silent, eyes wide with anticipation, but Kagan didn't return with a ruling. Not yet. She sat, removed her glasses, folded her hands, and then she did something unexpected. "Before we continue," she said, "I want to ask you something, Congresswoman. Off the record." Crockett blinked. "Why now?" Kagan asked. "You've had this information. You've been in office for years. What made you bring it here to me?" Crockett took a breath. "Because until now, I didn't think it would matter. I thought it would be buried, but when I saw your name on the docket, I thought maybe you'd listen." Kagan leaned back, thoughtful, quiet. "You think I'm fair?" "I think you were," Crockett said, "and maybe you still are. But even fair judges start protecting the system when they've been inside it too long." The courtroom sat motionless. The fire between these two women wasn't about animosity. It was about the collision of truth and tradition. And something was changing. Not just in the room, but in her. For the first time since the hearing began, something in the room softened. Not in tension. Tension still pulsed beneath every breath, but in tone. There was a shift, a thaw, as if both women, one in a robe, the other with a leather case, had just glimpsed a truth neither could deny. Justice Elena Kagan leaned forward. Her fingers rested lightly on the bench as she spoke, not with authority, but with something rare in that chamber, vulnerability. "I can't fix everything you've shown me," she said. "But I can make sure this hearing doesn't end the way it started." Across the room, Jasmine Crockett exhaled, not in relief, not in victory, but in something quieter. A release. A letting go of the tension she had carried in every muscle since walking through those courthouse doors. She nodded. "Then maybe," she said, "we both did our jobs today." There was no applause, no dramatic score, just a shared pause between two women who had both been trained to protect the institutions they served, and who for once chose to question them instead. Kagan lifted her gavel, but didn't bring it down. "Before I issue a decision," she said, "I'll allow one final statement for the record." Crockett stood. She turned to face the courtroom, not just Kagan but the packed gallery filled with reporters, students, former judges, activists, and skeptics. Some had come expecting spectacle, others, a scolding. What they got instead was a reckoning. Her voice was steady, but softer now. "I love this country," she began. "That's why I speak up. I love the law. That's why I won't pretend it's perfect, and I believe in justice. But belief without confrontation is just faith without work." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "If that's contempt," she said finally, "then so be it." Then she sat. No one moved. No one dared break the silence. Justice Kagan looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned her eyes back to the bench, her voice returning to its official cadence, though now laced with something deeply human. "The court has reviewed the documents," she said, "considered the statements made under oath, and examined the material relevance to current judicial ethics." She turned to the gallery. "Representative Crockett did not come here to be celebrated," she continued. "Nor did she come to apologize. She came with accusations and with proof." She turned back to Crockett, her tone now deliberately measured. "Your comments, while pointed and politically charged, were not without foundation. The court finds that they fall within the protections granted to you as a public official, speaking on matters of public concern." A breath audible from the audience. The pressure valve had shifted. Crockett didn't smile. She didn't move. She simply closed her eyes for one moment. Inhale, exhale. Still. Then Kagan delivered the verdict. "This court does not find sufficient grounds to proceed with contempt charges." Near the back of the room, someone clapped once, then caught themselves. Kagan raised her hand slightly, not to scold but to signal that she wasn't finished. "However," she said, her tone growing more deliberate, "this hearing has exposed deeper fractures. Fractures that go beyond one individual. As such, I will be issuing a formal judicial memorandum recommending a full ethics review at the federal level." Gasps this time, audible, widespread. She tapped the envelope beside her, the one Crockett had handed over. "These documents," she said, "will be submitted to the proper oversight channels without redaction." The silence that followed was not empty, it was stunned. She didn't slam the gavel, she simply placed it down. Gentle. Final. "This hearing is concluded." Crockett stood and gathered her things slowly, methodically. No rush, no victory strut, just the deliberate movements of a woman who knew the battle wasn't over. It had simply shifted arenas. As she turned, she met the eyes of those in the crowd. Law students who would one day write the rules she had just challenged. Journalists who would decide how to frame her actions. Former colleagues who once dismissed her as too loud, too bold, too dangerous. Now, no one spoke. Outside the courthouse, the media storm waited. Dozens of cameras blinked to life the moment she emerged. Microphones stretched toward her like outstretched arms. "Congresswoman, do you feel vindicated?" Someone shouted. She paused at the top of the stairs, looked out at the chaos. "This wasn't about vindication," she said. "It was about truth, and it's not over." Then she descended into the crowd, unmoved by the flashbulbs and headlines, already thinking about what came next. Justice Kagan sat alone in her chambers. Her robe was off, draped carefully over the back of a chair. Before her sat the transcript, the whistleblower letter, and Crockett's steady voice replaying in her mind. Her assistant knocked. "The press is requesting a statement." Kagan didn't look up. No comment. The door clicked shut. She remained still for a long time, staring at the evidence that now lived not just on paper, but inside her own conscience. She had spent a career defending the court's integrity. Today, for the first time, she had defended the truth. 1 week had passed since the courtroom standoff that stunned a nation. The headlines had already faded. Cable news had moved on to scandals and celebrity divorces. Social media found new outrage. Jasmine Crockett's name was no longer trending. But while the world spun forward, she didn't. In her quiet office in Washington, D.C., the late afternoon sun cast long, golden beams across her desk. Piles of documents sat open, annotated, highlighted, some from the hearing, others newly delivered. The room was silent. Save for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the occasional buzz of her phone, she hadn't answered most of the calls. Crockett sat in her chair, legs folded beneath her, eyes fixed on the ceiling. She was exhausted, not from the battle, but from the weight of knowing what still lay ahead. The courtroom was only the first round. What comes after truth is always harder. What you do with it. She thought about everything. The look on Kagan's face, the silence of the gallery, the fire she'd felt in that final moment, not rage, not triumph, but clarity. There was a knock. Her legislative aide stepped in, holding a thick envelope. "This just arrived," she said, by hand, from Justice Kagan's office. Crockett took it quietly, no ceremony. She opened it slowly. Inside was a formal letter. The structure was stiff, typed margins, proper formatting, but the tone was deeply personal. "I may not have agreed with your method," the letter read, "but I cannot deny the necessity of your message. You forced a conversation many of us have avoided for far too long. For that, I owe you more than a ruling. Elena Kagan." There was no handwritten signature, just her name, printed neatly at the bottom. Kagan knew what she was doing, leaving no flourish for the press to dissect, just a quiet acknowledgement, just the crack of something beginning to break open. Crockett folded the letter and placed it on the desk beside her. She didn't smile. Not quite. But something shifted. Across the room stood a small whiteboard, her personal reminder wall. At the top, in thick black marker, were the words, "What are we doing that actually matters?" That line had been there for months, but now, finally, she reached for the dry erase marker again. Underneath it, she wrote, "Pushing even when it gets you punished." Then she capped the marker and stood still, not triumphant, not weary, just resolute. Her phone buzzed again. 2 calls waiting from Congressional Oversight Committee chairs. 3 more emails from investigative journalists. A voicemail from a first-year law student in Arizona who said the hearing made her believe again in public service. That one made her pause. She pressed play on the message. The young voice trembled slightly, nervous but sincere. "I just wanted to say, watching you stand there alone made me think maybe I could go to law school and still be me. Not shrink myself to fit. Thank you." Crockett let the message finish. No reply needed. Not yet. But it meant something. She turned back to her desk, picked up her phone, opened the voice memo app. A habit she'd developed over the years, recording thoughts late at night. Some turned into speeches. Most stayed private. But they kept her honest. She hit record. I don't care if they called it a victory. This wasn't about winning. This was about forcing a system to look itself in the mirror, and I'll do it again. Every time, because if fear of consequence is what silences us, we've already lost. She hit stop, saved it, set the phone down. The weight of what had happened was still sinking in. Kagan's letter, the ruling, the ethics review now underway. But none of it was the end. This wasn't the kind of win you parade. This wasn't the kind of story with a standing ovation. It was quiet, messy, uncomfortable, real. And real change doesn't wear a crown. It comes with bruises, backlash, and silence when the cameras go home. Jasmine Crockett knew all of this. And still, she chose it. For every whistleblower. For every law student watching from the back of the room. For every voter who thought no one inside the system would ever call it out. This story wasn't hers alone anymore. It belonged to everyone who ever asked, "Will it matter if I speak up?" Her answer? Yes. Speak. Even when your voice shakes. Even when the room is full of people with cleaner reputations and safer careers. Even when silence is easier. Speak. Because silence keeps things easy, and easy doesn't change anything. Days later, Jasmine Crockett sat quietly in her car outside the Capitol, watching the city move as if nothing had happened. Her name had faded from headlines, but the impact hadn't. Inside her, something had changed. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't relieved. She was ready. The phone buzzed. More oversight calls. More questions. More work. But before stepping out, she recorded one last voice memo. It was never about me. It was about proving that truth still has a place in rooms built to silence it. She ended the recording, not to archive the moment, but to remind herself what the fight was for. Then she opened the door and stepped into the next battle. Because justice doesn't rest, and neither would she. Sometimes, truth doesn't roar. It stands alone in a quiet courtroom and refuses to back down. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself. She challenged a system that's been silent for too long. And while the headlines may fade, the questions she forced into the light remain. So, if this story moved you, if it made you think, question, or believe again in the power of speaking up, don't let it stop here. Like this video, drop your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in her place? And subscribe, because stories like this, we're just getting started. Truth matters, even when it costs. Thanks for watching.